Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our, believe it or not, September K-State Garden Hour. We've been doing these series since 2020. Hard to believe we're in 4 years, and this is a production of the entire K-State horticulture team. And we're glad to reach over 50,000 people through our K-State Garden Hours. So we're going to be continuing these in the future for free, but as you saw this slide there on the intro. If you'd like to make a donation, please do so to help support the K-State Garden Hour in the future. This webinar, as we said, is hosted by K-State Research and Extension. I'm your host for today. My name is Dennis Patton. I'm one of the horticulture agents here in Johnson County. And everyone involved in the K-State Garden Hour is part of the Extension horticulture professional team at K-State. And we're so glad to be working together to promote gardening in the state of Kansas and to people throughout the country. So before we get started, here's a few little housekeeping details for you guys all. Please help us by using the Q&A feature for your questions instead of the chat. We have two people that are going to be moderating those Q&A questions. And if you kind of look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little pop-up, and in the middle there is one that says Q&A. Please put your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom link today. And also, we're going to be recording this session, and it'll be posted in a day or so. And if we have any topics, links, or anything along those lines that are part of the presentation, handouts, the references, those type of things, everything will be found on the K-State Garden Hour website. So you can go back and rewatch this presentation, or any of the past presentations, if you missed those, will also be on the K-State Garden Hour website. Our moderators today, as I said, are going to be ones helping organize questions and Q&A, and they are Calla Edwards from Butler County and Lynn Lowry from Wyandotte County. And we're so glad you joined us today because we have a very interesting and informative topic for many of us today, and that's going to be tips on saving seeds from our garden. We are very fortunate today to have one of our horticulture agents, staff member, Jesse Gilmore, who's going to be presenting today, who is a K-State graduate with his master's and undergraduate degree. And he is residing in the Wildcat District, which is kind of down in the corner of Southeast Kansas. So give us a moment to get our programs transferred over to Jesse, and we'll get started.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Very excited to be here teaching you guys a little bit about saving seeds. Ensuring Future Generations was a subtitle I chose for this program because it's kind of has multiple meanings in the realm of saving seeds. You're ensuring future generations of the plants that you want to grow, but you're also ensuring future generations by saving seeds that will then go on to multiply into other plants. Right before the program started, I actually found a really poignant quote from American clergyman Robert Schuller that anyone can count the number of seeds in an apple, but only God can count the number of apples in a seed. And that is very poignant because it reflects the multiplicative, I think that's the right way to pronounce that word. Basically, the way that seed saving multiplies into an abundant harvest. There we go. So we're going to talk a little bit today about the what and the why of saving seeds, and then the bulk of the presentation is going to be the how. There will also be a little bit of a mention at the end about the legality of saving seeds, because there are some people who are pretty nervous about saving seeds, especially in the wake of some Supreme Court cases from Monsanto and other seed tech companies like Pioneer. I am not a lawyer, but I will do my best to walk you through the laws and what they mean for saving seeds from an individual perspective. But first, we're going to start with the what and the why. As you can see here, someone's living room has been completely taken over by seed saving, and that is reflective of how addictive this can be, especially if you get into selecting for certain desirable characteristics. Seed saving is the act of collecting and storing seeds for germinating and growing in subsequent seasons. It doesn't necessarily need to be the next season after you collect them. And we'll talk a little bit about some ways to store seeds for multiple years. But just know that it is the collection and storage of seeds. And over on the right, you can see an example of a seed bank and the different packets of seeds and their specific species names. Seed can be stored in seed banks run by international organizations like the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, all the way down to the local and even individual level. We have some libraries down here in Southeast Kansas who are putting together seed banks for people to grow their own vegetables, because while the community garden can provide some of the vegetables, they quickly run out at the food pantry and would like to encourage people to learn the skill of growing their own food and self-sufficiency. So there are some pros and cons to seed saving, and we're going to talk a little bit through each of them, whether or not seed saving may be for you or not for you, depending on your goals for your specific garden. So if you are interested in seed saving, if you think seed saving might be something you benefit from, you probably want to save money on inputs. This is initially how I decided to approach this presentation. If you gather seed from your garden for next year, you won't have to buy seed. And typically for most gardeners who do save seed, that's not going to be the primary reason why they are interested in saving seed. Even heirloom seeds aren't particularly expensive at the scale that most backyard gardeners are going to be doing things. If you're doing things commercially, it will be a little bit different. Seed saving might also be for you if you want similar performance from your garden plants for next year, because in most cases, assuming that you practice good techniques for seed saving, your seeds and the plants that result from them are going to be very similar to the plants that you had in your garden this previous year. You want to share rare varieties with other gardeners. Oftentimes, when we are talking about saving seeds, we are talking about removing seeds from heirloom varieties. Heirloom varieties has become kind of a catch-all term for any open pollinated variety. Originally, heirloom varieties were actually passed down from family member to family member who was responsible for breeding that particular heirloom variety. And if you go onto heirloom variety websites, you will see that some of those heirloom varieties date back to the mid 1800s, maybe even early 1800s. The primary reason why most people are interested in seed saving is that you want to preserve genetic diversity of food crops. Just like with the stock market, for anything biology related, diversity mitigates risk. So the more genetic diversity we can have, the less likely we are going to be impacted by major disease and loss occurrences. One of the primary examples of how genetic diversity is lack of genetic diversity is eventually going to hurt us is in the banana. So the banana, for most commercial growers, about 97 to 98%, depending on the sources that you find, of commercially grown bananas are going to be what is known as the Cavendish variety. And the reason that the Cavendish variety became so prominent is because it was immune or incredibly resistant to the most destructive disease of bananas at the time, also known as Panama disease. But the problem is that now there are so many Cavendish varieties out there in the wild and in commercial farms that if Panama disease were ever to mutate and overcome that resistance, almost all of the entire banana crop would be wiped out. And so the banana is one of the most likely major food crops to go extinct within our lifetime. And that's why there is now a renewed interest in getting more genetic diversity back into the banana crop. Seed saving might not be for you. However, there are a couple of reasons why you might not want to attempt to save seeds from your garden. If you want to experiment with different varieties next year, it's typically not worth going to the trouble of seed saving if you are just going to put different plants in the ground next year, because those seeds that you save, they're going to be the same varieties you just grew. And especially if those varieties were not very well performing, you are going to be more likely to find a better performing variety with something different. You also might not be interested in seed saving if you want to harvest everything you grow. One of the most agonizing things about seed saving is leaving plants in the ground when you could be harvesting them and eating them. It just feels like a wasted opportunity if you see your lettuce bolt and then start flowering. And at that point, it's not a edible quality for the most part, at least for people. So you have to really fight that urge to harvest everything that you grow if you are interested in saving seeds. Seed saving is also not worth the effort if you are growing hybrid varieties. And we'll touch a little bit more about this particular point when we get to the pollination side of seed saving. But just know for now that if you want seeds for plants that have the same characteristics as the parent plant, you're going to need to avoid hybrid plants. So this is just a little bit of an example about how seed saving is impacting the world. This is the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Svalbard, which is a territory of Norway up in the Arctic Circle. They built this in order to preserve genetic diversity of rare heirloom varieties as well as rare plants that are on the verge of going extinct. So this is built into the side of a mountain. It's maintained at a constant temperature and moisture. And this is an example of large-scale international cooperation for the sake of genetic diversity into plants. I don't know about anyone else, but I would very much like to tour this at some point. So there are 5 primary steps to seed saving. This is going to be the how of the presentation. And you can see the 5 steps here. The first is garden planning. That's choosing what you want to grow and designing the garden layout. Layout matters a lot more than you would think when it comes to designing your vegetable garden for the year. The most important step, however, is going to be controlling pollination between individual plants. And that seems like a fool's errand because a lot of times plants are going to be insect pollinated. There are specific things that you can do to make sure that your seeds come what is known as true to type, or exhibiting the characteristics of the parent plants. Your third step is going to be harvesting the seeds once they are ready for harvesting. Your fourth step, I've kind of combined 2 mini steps into one step here, processing the seeds and drying them, and then storing them into the future. So step number 1 is to plan your garden. And anytime I am telling someone how to go about designing a garden, I always tell them your number 1 priority needs to be grow what you enjoy eating. And obviously that's not saying fit square pegs into round holes. Some plants just will not do well in certain spots. Fruiting vegetables like tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers are going to need as much sun as possible, whereas leaf vegetables, if they're in full sun for too long, can end up scorching. So you don't want to ignore your site characteristics in order to try growing things. But if you enjoy eating the plants that you grow, you are more likely to enjoy saving the seeds as well. And you are more likely to use the seeds once you do save them. You need to look for heirloom. Sometimes they are labeled as open pollinated seeds. You should be avoiding hybrids, and I promise we'll get to the reason why here in a second. Unfortunately, there are so many niche heirloom or open pollinated varieties that there's little to no research on suitable heirloom varieties for your area. Now, there are exceptions to this. For example, very commercially successful heirloom varieties like Cherokee Purple, they are so popular with heirloom gardeners that there is a moderate amount of research on where those do the best. But there are many heirloom varieties that don't get any research done on them because of the overwhelming number of varieties and genetic diversity that exists. So typically when you're looking for heirloom varieties, There's two ways to go about it. The first is to rely on the experiences of others and what worked for them and did not work for them. Typically, that's going to be located in your relative geographic area. You are not going to want to look unless you have friends or fellow gardeners in the area that have tried specific varieties. They are always worth asking. But typically, when you're on commercial websites like Baker Creek, you're not going to find someone that is in your exact area. So it will need a little bit of flexibility. But that's where number two comes in, where you should grow varieties that catch your interest. A lot of times heirlooms are grown just as much for their visual flair in the garden as they are for their production. This is just an example of a review left on Baker Creek's website. Baker Creek is my go-to for heirloom seeds, but there are plenty of different sites that do something similar to this. Down at the bottom of the review, you can see their general location. And that'll give you an idea of what zone they grew it in and whether or not that particular area would be successful for that heirloom variety, and whether or not you might have success with that particular variety in your area as well. It is always worth reading the reviews. This is for a specific type of bean called the dragon's tongue bean, because I have to include purple stuff since I work for K-State. Step number 2, control pollination. So pollination is the sexual reproduction between two gametes to form an embryo, which is in this case is going to be the seed. When gametes are formed in their respective plants, they have half a set of chromosomes, and chromosomes encode everything about the plant, genes, and their expression. So the chromosomes are going to be very important for displaying characteristics of the plant. You know, how much does it produce? How tall does it grow? How disease resistant is it going to be? And so you get half from the father plant and you get half from the mother plant. You combine them and you get one full set of chromosomes. To get true to type seed, which is, as I mentioned previously, is the type of seed that will display the characteristics of the parent plant, you need the two gametes to be as close genetically as possible. And if you can get them to be of the same variety, you are going to be much closer to that homogeneous chromosome set than if you were, for example, combining two different varieties of the same species together. So when pollination occurs between two different varieties, the resulting hybrid plants, and you will see that very frequently on seeds, will not have the same characteristics as either parent plant. Instead, you are going to get a muddling of the two different sets of chromosomes in order to get a set of characteristics that are somewhere in between the two parent plants. This can be good for plant breeders who are interested in introducing specific characteristics to a line or a breed. But unless you are very interested in trying to breed your own plants, cross-pollination is something that you want to avoid. And so getting it a little bit into the mindset of preventing the bees from getting to your flowers will actually help quite a bit with getting the seeds that you need. If you, instead of wanting just the same plants every year, you don't care about that, you only need seeds and you don't particularly care how uniform they are, then cross-pollination is absolutely going to be worthwhile for your garden, and it's not something you would need to prevent. There are 4 ways to prevent cross-pollination between different varieties, and each has its pros and cons. The first is to plant only a single variety of a given species. That way you don't have to be as concerned about different varieties cross-pollinating with yours. Insects will travel, wind will carry pollen. So if you have neighbors who garden, this will not always guarantee that you won't get cross-pollination. It also has the drawback of potentially running into diversity issues in your own garden, where if that one variety doesn't have a lot of success in the spot that you put it, you are going to be out of luck for that particular plant for the year. So instead, you might be interested in putting physical distance between varieties of the same species. This is oftentimes how commercial seed producers will go about preventing cross-pollination. it is very important, if you want to do this and you have the space to do this, to look at the manner in which your specific crop is pollinated. So for example, spinach is wind pollinated, and that pollen grain is very, very fine, to the point that the wind can carry the pollen up to 2 miles. And so oftentimes, especially if the genetic preservation is very important to the producer, you're going to need to separate it more than 2 miles. And I'm pretty sure most backyard gardeners are not going to have 2 miles worth of land to space out their specific varieties. If they're insect pollinated, 800 feet to 2,500 feet. If they are self-pollinated, you really only need about 10 feet between plants. Of course, that is the maximum. You probably could get away with them being closer, but you typically want to err on the side of caution when it comes to separation distances. Your third option is to choose varieties that have different flowering and maturity times. If you have 2 varieties and one opens in March and one opens in May, then that is going to exclude the pollen from the other variety, because by the time one is done flowering, the other one has not quite started yet. That is where understanding and reading the seed package or seed catalog about the characteristics of that particular variety will come in handy. And then your last option is to bag flowers to prevent outside pollen from reaching the flowers. This is really only going to work for plants that self-pollinate. So 3 of the easiest plants to start with when you are first into seed saving: tomatoes, beans, and peas. These are all self-pollinating, and so this bagging technique over the flowers would work just fine to keep insects from coming to them. Beans and peas are a really good beginner option for seed saving for another reason that we'll get into later. When it comes to pollination, and only occurs within the same species. So even if you get down to the same genus, if they are not the same species, your pollination is not going to be successful. The one major exception in the vegetable garden that you need to watch out for is Brassica oleracea. That's going to be at least 7 different types of vegetables, all of which are a different variety or subspecies, and all of which can cross-pollinate with each other. So you don't want more than 1, maybe 2 of these in the garden at once. And that's going to be broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kale, Brussels sprouts, collard greens, and kohlrabi, among others. But those are the most common. One other pair of garden vegetables that you might want to watch out for are beets and Swiss chard. They are the same species, and so will cross-pollinate with each other. Beets are just the root form of the species, and Swiss chard is just the leaf form. Okay, harvesting and processing your seed. So when you are choosing plants that you want to produce seed for next year, it pays to think like a plant breeder. You want to select plants for the seed production that are exhibiting the best characteristics for your specific site. So if you're wanting tall plants or short plants, if you don't have a ton of space and you have smaller plants, for example, melons or zucchini that stay more compact, that would definitely be a characteristic to select for. So you would look at your plants, you would pick the ones that have the smallest size or the biggest fruit, and you would let those go to seed. And that's going to look a little bit different depending on what species of plant you are trying to grow. But in most cases, market maturity, or when you would harvest in order to eat the vegetable, that is not going to be adequate for seed maturity. The only exceptions that I was able to find when creating this presentation are tomatoes and melons, which are the seed is harvested at the same time that the fruit is harvested. Some seeds will actually dry themselves while still on the plant. This is where beans and peas come into play as some of the easiest, because you just leave them on the plant until the pod cracks in your hand, and until you cannot dent the seed with your fingernail anymore. At that point, they will be hard enough to put into storage. Seeds absolutely must be dried before storage. If not, and moisture is included in with the seeds, you are going to potentially introduce mold into the seeds, at which point you would likely need to toss the entire amount of seeds that you have saved, or potentially the seeds will germinate early in the place that you are storing them. Wet seeds will need extra processing. Tomato seeds in particular are ones that will need a little bit of fermentation in order to remove the gel from around the seeds that protect the seed from accidentally sprouting while inside the fruit. That is just one way that plants preserve as many seeds as possible until the right time to send them out into the world and hopefully have them all germinate. Step 5, the last step, storing the seeds. You're going to need a cool, dark, and dry location. Artificial light is typically okay, like in a refrigerator, but sunlight is a no-no. And the reason for that is that some seeds will break dormancy when exposed to sunlight. You also don't want it to be too cold because some seeds have what is known as a stratification. A stratification dormancy requirement. So stratification just means a specific amount of exposure to a temperature below a certain level. Biologically, that is the winter period where the temperatures drop. And after a certain amount of time, the plant will assume that the cold temperatures are gone and then germinate that way. So you don't want the temperatures to be too cold when you are storing these seeds. Basements are typically optimal because they don't allow a ton of sunlight in. When you store them, mason jars are my go-to for storing, but you can store them in plastic bags as well. Opaque envelopes are typically better than plastic bags because you are less likely to let sunlight in. In any case, whatever you put the seeds in, you want to label the seeds with the variety that you have and the date that you harvested them. When you buy seeds from garden centers or nurseries or department stores like Home Depot, almost all of the time they will come with an expiration date on the package. That is more for labeling requirements than it is a good indicator of how long the seeds will last. Seeds last longer than their expiration date quite often when they are in the right environment for storage. So you don't necessarily need to rush to use all of the seeds that you harvested in the next year. So this is just a couple of examples of seed packages that have some terminology that you need to keep an eye out for when buying seeds. On the right, you can see what is known as an F1 hybrid. Sometimes you will just see them labeled as hybrid. Sometimes you will just see them labeled as F1. They mean the same thing in that there were two varieties that were crossed with each other, and so the seeds that you get from the parent plants will often not have the characteristics or be extremely different from the parent plants. On the left, you're going to see Mountain Valley Seed Company, and on the back, you've got open pollinated plants. Or open pollinated seeds. So looking for that, looking for heirloom. Those are going to be the terms that you want to look for when going to buy seed locally. There are plenty of great seed providers online, of which I would recommend, just based on my experiences with them, Baker Creek and Seed Savers Exchange. But there are a growing number of opportunities for local heirloom seed purchasing. Okay, the fun part. There is a hesitation to get into seed saving because of some legal background that is making people nervous. So I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice, and I have to say that, but based on what I have been able to research about this particular topic, there's really two main codified laws relating to seed technology. And when I say seed technology, I mean seeds that have been bred either traditionally or artificially to have certain genes or certain characteristics within them. That's going to be the Plant Patent Act of 1930 and the Plant Variety Protection Act of 1970. The Plant Patent Act of 1930 was brought to Congress by nursery producers who were breeding vegetatively and reproducing vegetatively their own specific lines of different plants. And to the best of my research, the Plant Patent Act of 1930 applies only to asexually propagated plants, which includes layering, vegetative cuttings, things like that. Because asexually propagated is in the wording of the law, that does not apply to pollinated plants because that is sexually propagated plants. The Plant Variety Protection Act of 1970 grants certificates of protection for breeders of new, distinct, uniform, and stable varieties. And so new and uniform in this particular instance is going to do a lot of protection for backyard gardeners, specifically of heirloom varieties whose lineage has been well traced, and you can trace it back to a certain period in time. The farther back you can go, the more that the new word in that definition is going to protect you, and uniform. While we do our best to keep the seeds that we save as uniform as possible, showing off the same characteristics, it is inevitable that at least a little bit of your cross-pollination is going to occur despite your best efforts to prevent it. So that reduces the uniformity of the seeds that you save and will protect you as well. A lot of the, or should protect you as well. It always depends when it comes to law. But a lot of the issues with seed saving really spawned from Monsanto and a couple of their cases in the early 2000s when it came to people using seed with specifically patented technologies. I would say that for me, I would feel comfortable saving seed for myself. Selling seed that you save runs into its own extra set of legal issues and would be much less likely to be protected because you would run into issues with labeling laws and germination tests that would be required before you could sell the seed. So I would recommend avoiding selling any seed that you save and just using it nonprofit related. These are a couple of the resources that I used when creating this presentation. My favorite resource, this is not the only copy of this book that I have. It's the Manual of Seed Saving by Andrea Heistinger. She did a lot of research into the different families of plants that you can grow in your garden and how the seed saving techniques vary from family to family. There's a lot of vegetables in here that are more niche. So vegetables that are going to be a lot harder to find, vegetables that you might not find information for elsewhere. But if you do find information for more niche products, it's probably going to be from the Seed Savers Exchange, which published The Seed Garden, The Art and Practice of Seed Saving. And as far as sources of seed, both Seed Savers Exchange and Baker Creek specialize in heirloom varieties. And especially with Baker Creek, it is very much fun to look through the catalog, even if you don't end up buying anything, because it's a visual feast for the eyes. Lots of different characteristics to pick from. Some people that I know plan their entire vegetable garden just around what looks cool out of the Baker Creek catalog. And that is a totally, that is one absolutely fabulous way to design a fun looking garden. And then keeping what you had success with and not buying again what you didn't next year. So that's all I've got. Ended a little early, but I do see that we have some questions in the Q&A. So I will take a couple of those.
Hey,
Yeah, so
Jesse.
Oh, I was just gonna thank Jesse for his presentation, and now I'll turn it over to Lynn and Kala to ask the questions that came up in the chat
Okay,
or in
Jesse,
the
this is
Q&A.
Lynn.
All right.
The first question is purchasing produce from the grocery store and then saving the seeds from that produce. What's your impression of the quality there?
So you can try it. There is absolutely no harm in trying to save those seeds and germinate them next year. Just keep in mind that 99 times out of 100, you're going to be buying a hybrid tomato from the grocery store. And the reason for that, actually, I did not touch on that, and that will be a good thing to point out. When you have hybrids versus heirlooms, what you really need to look at is how prevalent disease is in your specific area. So traditionally in Southeast Kansas, we get about 45 inches of rain a year. It has been pretty dry for the last 18 months, but that has helped. And our vegetable gardens and most of the vegetable gardens that of people that I talk to, they say their vegetable gardens are doing better than they have in years. And it's not that water is the issue, but water invites fungal problems. Because heirloom varieties are open pollinated, they do not have the same rigorous characteristics that are bred and inbred into a hybrid line. So hybrids are much more disease resistant, and you can guarantee much more consistent production out of hybrids compared to heirlooms. And that's why the vast majority of commercial growers, no matter where you go in the United States, they're going to be growing hybrids. So you go to the grocery store, you get that produce, you can bring it home, but understanding that it is likely a hybrid fruit or vegetable, you can't expect consistency throughout the entire seed set. You likely would get germination and you likely would get production out of them, but they are not good for saving seeds across multiple generations. That would only be if you wanted something for this year before buying new seeds next year.
Next question. Is there a listing of seed libraries across the state of Kansas or any other state that you know of?
Oh, I just saw a map and I cannot for the life of me remember the name of the website, but it had a bunch of seed libraries. It's obviously not comprehensive by any means. I believe in my area, the closest one they had was in Carthage, Missouri. So they are consistently looking for seed libraries to add to the map, but they do exist. Those resources do exist.
And I know I just Googled it for Kansas City and several libraries popped up. So you can try that first and foremost.
Yeah, and I think libraries are probably the forerunner in terms of local organizations that are interested in doing seed banks and seed libraries. So they would be probably the first place I would check in your local area. I know we've got participants from all over the country, and maybe even from multiple countries. Your laws, if you are in a different country like Canada or the UK, for example, are going to be very different from our laws, especially across the pond in Europe. So I would definitely do more research on the laws relating to seed saving, because law, I'm very glad I'm not a lawyer, because the answer is always it depends.
And since you brought that up, there is a question about getting seeds from other countries and international laws.
So as far as the saving of the seeds themselves, to my knowledge, there is not any law restricting that. The problem will be when you try and bring a specific crop back into the United States. Back in 2017, I took a trip to Hawaii for an urban food systems class. We went through Honolulu and learned a lot about the tropical agriculture. But going into Hawaii and coming out of Hawaii, we had to declare if we had any agricultural crops that we were taking back to the mainland or bringing in from the mainland. And that's to protect ecosystems. The USDA is very, very strict about that kind of thing. So that is, I think, where you would run into most of your problems when it comes to saving seed like that. But in a lot of cases, especially with the bigger heirloom seed companies like Baker Creek, they will bring in they're known as land races or wildly developed varieties of different crops native to other parts of the world and sell them as niche crops for the general public. So oftentimes you would not really need to worry about that, assuming that you can find the crops that you are interested in locally, which is becoming more and more possible with every passing year.
Another question is, will there be a noticeable difference in hardiness? Of an example would be a bur oak acorn in Kansas City versus one in Hays. So is there a distance you want to kind of look at when looking at seed saving?
Sure. So that relates to the concept of provenance, or PROVENANCE. That follows the line of thought that local seed is always going to be more productive in a local environment. And you will have people who make it their entire careers to go out and find seeds from specific areas. Missouri will actually take seed and purchase seed of specific species from people in Missouri so that they can propagate them for their seedling conservation program sale. Provenance is a very powerful tool for minimizing the amount of stress. So you have a bur oak in Hays. It is going to be much more adapted for lower rainfall than a bur oak in Kansas City. So going out and looking for those characteristics, picking out where those specific characteristics are most likely to occur, and then finding specimens from that area and picking the best ones from those specimens. It's a lot like selecting the best plants from your garden that are showing the characteristics that you want passed down, just with plants that are native and not put there really intentionally for the most part. But yes, provenance is a great way to select strong future plants based on the seeds that are produced from individuals.
A basic question is, if you're collecting seeds, what's critical that you keep on the package or the container you're storing them in?
Sure.
Examples would be name, date, that kind of stuff.
Species, which if you're only dealing with garden plants, that is not typically going to be as important. If you go back to, let's back up real quick. So if you look at these packages right here, this is going to be a little more formal than most backyard gardeners are going to need. You've got the species name, you've got the location it was found in. If you are only saving seeds out of your garden, you're not going out and finding seeds out in the wild, you don't really need the location that it was collected. You would want common name at least, variety. If you really want to go the extra mile, scientific name would also work, and also the date that you harvested them so that you have an idea of how long they've been in storage. Like I said, for most plants, they will live just fine in storage. There are specific types of plants called recalcitrant plants. These are opposed to orthodox plants that will actually be killed off by cool conditions that you typically need to store most seeds in. These are going to be tropical plants like mango, guava, seeds that really do not do well at low temperatures because the plants that they are from do not do well at low temperatures, but they are in the vast minority. So assuming that you can make your environment what you need you know, cool, dark, and dry, most seeds are going to do fine. And you just need name, variety, and date on the label. Anything extra that you want to include, I would definitely go ahead and include it, but those are the 3 that I would include on every package that I would save.
And Jesse, there's several questions on saving flower seeds. Do you want to address that, or should we make that a topic for another training opportunity?
Yes, so saving flower seeds operates much in the same way as saving vegetable seeds. The nice thing about saving flower seeds is that often, I can't think of any examples to the contrary, they will be dried on the flower. So you don't need to really do any processing of the seed aside from getting them into the storage container that you are keeping it in, be that a mason jar or an envelope or a plastic bag. I do believe, and let me check real quick. No. Okay. So in the Heistinger book, I believe they have very few flowers included. But most of that's going to be vegetables. There are resources, and if anyone is interested in looking up more resources, I would absolutely recommend going to the Seed Saver Exchange. They have a lot of guides to starting and beginning seed saving, as well as specific crop guides, so you know what to look for tomatoes, for example. I'm not sure if they have flowers, but they would be the most likely group to start with for looking for information on flower seed saving.
Back to one of the legal questions, and I know you're not a lawyer. Are there restrictions on selling plants raised from saved seeds?
Ooh. Yes. I believe it was 1994 where they added the restriction that you cannot sell plants grown from saved seeds, specifically for the Plant Variety Protection Act of 1970. So that is going to cover I know there are, but as for details, I couldn't say exactly what they are.
Hey, there's a couple questions on if you can go into a little more detail about how to process seeds saved from tomatoes. That
Sure.
wet, whatever you called it, the wet process.
Yep. So when you have tomato seeds, they are surrounded by a gel when they're still in the fruit. Pretty much the reason why I don't like eating tomatoes is the texture. It's very slimy. It's to keep water from getting to the seeds. Ironically, that gel is water repellent. So the seeds are basically in a moisture-free environment inside that gel. But you need to break that gel up before you can dry and save the seeds. And so a lot of times that's going to have to do with fermentation. The main way to do that is to include a little bit of water in the jar with the seeds and the jelly that you're trying to break up, as well as a little bit of sugar in the mixture as well. And that's going to speed up the bacteria fermentation. These bacteria are not going to be disease causing, but you can't leave the tomato seeds in the moisture mix for too long. Once the seed jelly starts kind of peeling off and gathering on its own, that's when you would need to remove it and dry it off. To a lesser extent, you will kind of experience the same thing with melon seeds, for example, especially cantaloupe. But tomatoes are by far the most processing intensive seed to save. The reason why a lot of publications will recommend tomato seed saving is specifically because of that self-pollination and because everyone loves tomatoes. It is the most popular garden vegetable, and so people are likely going to be saving that seed the most just because they enjoy tomatoes so much. But they will take a little extra work compared to most other garden vegetables that you could grow.
Lynn, did we lose you for more questions?
I'm sorry, my internet just went wacko.
Okay, sorry about that. You're back and ready to go?
Yep. So
Okay, cool.
how do you get seeds from leafy greens and in-ground veggies like kale, carrots, sweet potatoes?
Great question. So in most cases with leafy vegetables, you have to wait for them to bolt. And bolting is technically just a rapid growth of the stem. So when leafy vegetables are exposed to extreme heat very quickly, they think, oh God, I'm going to die. I need to get my flowers up and I need to get my seeds out into the environment as soon as possible before I do. And so you will see very quickly these stems start coming up out of the middle of the head, which will contain the flowers on top. Lettuce is actually also a self-pollinating flower. You're going to get a lot of seeds off of lettuce heads. Cabbage and kale, not as many, but that bolting is very necessary. So letting it go into, let's say, for example, you're growing them in the spring. Letting them grow into May makes it much more likely that they will bolt. And you got to be very attentive to when they do, because the seeds will come very soon afterwards. And if you let them self-sow, which is very likely, especially for lettuce, you're going to have a abundant lettuce crop next year, pretty much by accident, and not at all in nice, neat rows.
There's still some confusion around the hybrids and seed collecting versus vegetative cuttings. So can you somewhat refresh our memory as to what you said on all of that?
Sure. Hybrids are plants that combine the characteristics of two different varieties into a new generation. Those two varieties are going to contribute very different genes, and the plant is going to show a mix of those characteristics. It's not going to be like one parent plant or exactly like the other parent plant. And for people who have plants growing in the garden and can see how those parent plants are doing, you want your seeds to be as close to the parent plants as possible, so that you have a pretty good idea of their performance in the following year. So that's where open pollinated varieties come in. For the asexual propagation, that's going to be any way of getting a new plant that really does not include pollination. So, for example, African violets. You take a cutting of an African violet stem, you've got the leaf here, you got the stem here, you cut that off and you dip it in rooting powder. That's a hormone that's going to encourage root growth from that bud, and you're basically going to have a brand new plant from just that cutting. That didn't involve any pollination, that did not involve any genetic crossing. That individual plant is going to be genetically identical to the plant that you just cut it from, but it did not involve pollination. And so that quickly becomes a patented breed once you start doing it enough times and at uniformity. The Plant Variety Protection Act protects sexually propagated plants. So plants that did go through pollination and are uniform, a new variety that wasn't previously introduced, a stable variety that doesn't show a lot of change between generations. There was one other modifier that I can't remember. So for the Plant Patent Act of 1930, that is not something you need to worry about with seed saving. It is the Plant Variety Protection Act. And typically, if you are buying seeds from an heirloom specific company like Baker Creek that values tracking the history of the heirloom variety, you are going to have a company that is likely totally okay with you preserving the heirloom line, because some of these heirlooms were rescued on the brink of destruction, and were only brought back through repeated breeding and open pollination by companies like Baker Creek and by individual farmers who wanted to keep the heirloom variety alive. In general, the companies that you are getting these seed from would love for you to help protect the genetic diversity of the particular crop that you are growing.
Okay, question on cool conditions. Can you explain the difference between the freezer part of the refrigerator and the general
Sure.
where you store produce?
So cool conditions, that's going to be somewhere around 45 to 50 degrees. Refrigerators would also work. You do need to keep in mind that refrigerators will provide light, and it's not always going to break dormancy. Sunlight is much more likely to do that, but it is still a possibility. And it is going to keep the seeds much cooler than if you just left them out in a basement, for example, or a root cellar. Outside of specific crops that have a cold dormancy, there's no real benefit to keeping them in the fridge versus the basement, outside of the one single fact that the colder it is in the place that you store it, without freezing it, because freezing a lot of times will destroy the tissue, the slower the metabolism is of the seed. So when you have a seed, you've got a little embryo inside as well as the germplasm that basically functions as the embryo's energy source. The colder that something is, and this is true across all things, not just seeds, the slower their metabolism is going to get, and the slower that they use energy. So your seeds are likely going to last a little bit longer in the fridge compared to in the basement. You just want to make sure, especially if you are storing these seeds with other, like if you put it in the fridge with food items, for example, those food items can introduce water into the environment. So you would want something airtight, like a mason jar, like a Ziploc bag. Plant envelopes probably would not be the right storage solution for that setup.
Okay, that looks like we've caught the majority of the questions. Calla, you have any on your end?
I do not.
Okay, well, if we're done with questions, we'll turn it back over to the host to kind of wrap up for the day. Jesse, thank you so much for sharing all your information and knowledge and love and passion of seed saving. We can really tell that came across in your presentation today, and we really appreciate all the great questions and comments that came in through the Q&A session. I think we had a really good discussion today on seed saving. The session was recorded, as we said at the start of the hour, and it should be posted on the K-State Garden Hour website tomorrow afternoon. You'll also be receiving an evaluation on this session a little bit later, so please take time to fill that out and give us more ideas. And continue to join us the first Wednesday of every month for the K-State Garden Hour, as we have interesting topics coming up. And I know we're also starting to work on, hopefully not getting myself in trouble, the 2024 schedules to continue the K-State Garden Hour that have been so successful. So once again, thank you for attending today. And if you have any questions, be sure to reach out to your local county extension office, and we'll be glad to help you out with the questions. So have a good day, happy gardening, and I know from at least my part of the state, we hope we get lots of rain coming up because we could get out of the drought very quickly. So thanks so much, everyone, for enjoying the K-State Garden Hour.